Some men spend their entire lives preparing for the moment they'll prove their strength. But some moments don't care about preparation. They arrive unannounced, soaked in mud, and reveal the truth about everyone watching. If you've ever stepped onto the grinder at Coronado, you know the air has a particular weight to it, a tension that rides the Pacific wind and settles into the bones of everyone who walks there. And if you agree that sometimes the smallest person in the field is carrying the heaviest story, then like and subscribe, because what happened on that stretch of asphalt deserves to be remembered. I can tell you that the day Lieutenant Mara Tress arrived, late 20s, barely 5'4", and looking more like she belonged behind a medical chart than facing down 180 SEAL candidates, felt like the start of something no one recognized until it was far too late. From where I stood near the pull-up bars, clipboard in hand, I saw the mix of curiosity and quiet dismissal ripple through the formation the moment she walked into view. Mud pits ready, logs lined up, cold Pacific wind cutting through the morning. And though she moved with the calm certainty of someone who had already lived more life than most of them would by 40, the candidates saw only a petite medical officer with a tight bun and a clean uniform, a woman assigned to monitor their stress. Evaluation drills before Hell Week. They didn't see the way her eyes tracked every detail with clinical precision. They didn't see the faint scars, just barely visible, where her sleeve tugged back. They didn't see the coil of composure she carried like a weapon in a sheath. And most of all, they had no idea that before she ever stepped foot here, before her name appeared on a roster, before she was entrusted with their safety, she had already earned a quiet legend among those who survived long enough to tell her story. No, what they saw, what every candidate saw, was simply someone who looked out of place, someone small, someone they could test without consequences. I watched the tension brewing long before the first word was spoken. 3 candidates in particular, Briggs, Callan, and Ortiz, the kind of men who walked like they were still wearing college jerseys and threw their shoulders back with the restless need to prove themselves, followed her movements with smirks and sideways glances, nudging one another as if the universe had delivered entertainment directly onto their parade deck. She kept ignoring them, of course, because that was her way. Ignore the noise, stay focused, stay unshakable. She knelt beside a hydration crate, doing final checks on the medical kit she'd prepped hours before dawn, and the sun caught a sliver of metal on her wrist, a Ranger-issued watch, scratched to hell, the kind only someone who'd been forced to dive into dirt under mortar fire would own, and that sight alone should have warned them, but arrogance makes men blind. Briggs, big, broad, the unofficial ringleader, stepped forward with the swagger of someone whose strength had never truly been tested. And he tossed a glance at his buddies that said, "Watch this." "Doc," he called out to her, voice echoing across the grinder as every candidate went quiet. "You might want to sit this one out before you break a nail." The laugh he let out afterward was the kind of sound that asked for validation, and the rows behind him answered with low snickers, some amused, some uncertain, all oblivious to the fact that they were about to witness something they'd talk about for years. Mara didn't even flinch. She simply capped the saline she'd been checking and rose slowly, calmly, brushing one strand of wind-blown hair from her cheek. "I'm here to observe," she said, voice level, steady as bedrock. "Stay focused on the drill." Briggs grinned wider, sensing an audience. "Focused? Doc, you're about 5 inches shorter than the mud pit. You'd drown in it." His buddies laughed harder now, stepping closer, circling in a half-moon of mock dominance. I took a step forward to intervene, and Chief Vance shot me a look, the kind that meant let it play out. Vance had a sixth sense for moments that exposed men for who they really are, and something in his posture told me, recognize the shift in the air before any of us. The next moment unfolded so fast I'd barely processed it. Briggs jerked his chin at Callan and Ortiz, and with the careless bravado of men who thought the world bent for them, the two flanked Mara, grabbed her arms, not violently, but with the confident roughness of men who expected her compliance. And before she could pivot or step back, they dumped her straight into the mud pit, a heavy splash cutting through the silence. Mud coated her uniform, streaked across her face, dripped from her jawline, and Briggs, standing above her, laughed, loud and triumphant, as if he had just proven something meaningful. For a heartbeat, no one moved, not the candidates, not Vance, not even me. The world seemed to freeze around the image of her rising slowly from the pit, mud sliding off her like the shedding of skin. And it was in that silence that the real shift happened. Something behind Mara's eyes changed. Not anger, not humiliation, but a settling, the kind of internal click a soldier makes when a line has been crossed and an old instinct wakes up. She stepped forward, mud sucking at her boots, her expression unreadable except for the faint, icy calm that sent a pulse of unease through the formation. Briggs opened his mouth to deliver another insult, ready to escalate the scene he thought he controlled. But the pit had already chosen its victor, and Mara was no longer walking toward them as a medic monitoring candidates. She was walking toward them like someone who had survived far worse men in far worse conditions. And though the candidates didn't know it yet, this was the moment, this exact breath, this exact heartbeat, when everything changed. The moment when a quiet medic, underestimated and drenched in mud, would show 180 SEAL candidates that strength has nothing to do with size, and everything to do with what a person has endured and overcome long before they step into the fight. What happened next unfolded with the kind of unnerving speed that makes even seasoned instructors rethink what they believe about human capability, because the moment Mara stepped out of that mud, the candidates expected embarrassment, maybe anger, maybe a sharp reprimand, but not the absolute, surgical calm that moved across her frame like a shadow resetting itself. I watched her shift her footing, barely enough for anyone to notice. Her gaze fixed on Briggs with clinical focus, the kind a surgeon has before committing to a life-or-death cut, and before he could finish the smirk curving on his face, she closed the distance between them with a single, efficient stride. Briggs lifted his hands in mock defense, posture loose, cocky, ready to laugh. Then Mara dropped her weight, swept her right foot behind his knee, and with a torque that looked too precise to belong to someone her size, she hooked his arm, rotated her hips, and folded him into the ground. The sound wasn't loud, but every trained ear on that grinder heard the sharp, unmistakable pop of a shoulder slipping clean out of its socket, and Briggs's victorious grin instantly shattered into a raw, startled scream. The formation recoiled as one, like a single organism hit by an electric current. Ortiz and Callan lunged forward, anger propelled by ego more than loyalty, and I moved to yell at them. But Mara was already on the second one, stepping into his charge with a seamless pivot, catching his wrist midair, sliding under his arm with the grace of someone who had practiced these motions under real threat, and with another sharp, efficient pull she dislocated his shoulder almost gently, like someone opening a stuck cabinet with just the right pressure. Ortiz collapsed beside Briggs, clutching his arm, eyes wide in disbelief, breath coming in short, painful bursts as mud smeared into the fabric of his uniform. The third man, Callan, froze mid-step, his entire body rigid, his fist half raised as the reality of the situation slammed into him like cold water. He looked at her again, really looked, and something ancient in his instincts told him that she was not the easy target he had assumed, not a small medic who needed shielding, not a woman who could be pushed around in front of a crowd. She didn't bother facing him. She didn't lift a hand, didn't take a step, didn't do anything except turn her head just enough for him to see the calm indifference in her eyes, an unspoken warning sharper than any blade. And whatever courage he thought he had evaporated instantly. He lowered his hands, palms open, backing away like a man retreating from the edge of a cliff he hadn't realized he was standing on. Only then did the grinder fill with noise again. Whispers, the rustle of shifting boots, the confused glances bouncing through the formation like ricochets. Chief Vance stepped forward, but even he didn't break the silence immediately. His posture carried the weight of a man recalibrating everything he thought he knew about the medic he'd barely spoken to that morning. Mara, mud streaked across her cheek and sleeve, simply brushed dirt from her forearms and adjusted the strap of her medical kit with the quiet composure of someone who had just rearranged two grown men without even raising her voice. Briggs, still cradling his disabled shoulder, sputtered through gritted teeth. She attacked me. She's crazy. But even his friends didn't back him. Ortiz shook his head slowly, grimacing in pain, realization dawning. Around them, the candidates had gone still, not out of fear, although some of them certainly felt it, but out of the primal recognition that they had just witnessed something outside the usual hierarchy, outside the macho posturing and competitive bravado that defined BUD/S culture. They had seen a demonstration of controlled power so clean, so efficient, so absolutely confident that it felt almost mythic. Vance finally exhaled, stepping beside her with a mixture of irritation and awe. "Lieutenant," he said, voice slow, careful, as if addressing a coiled storm rather than a person. "You want to explain why two of my candidates are in a horizontal screaming competition?" She looked up at him with a polite, almost innocent expression. "They slipped," she said deadpan. A ripple of laughter burst through the ranks, nervous, shocked, but edged with undeniable respect. Vance's mouth twitched in the barest hint of a grin. He rubbed his jaw, weighing his next words. "You planning on dislocating the third one too?" She shrugged lightly. "Only if he insists." Callan swallowed so hard I could hear it from 5 feet away. Vance barked an order for medics, and several corpsmen hurried forward, their faces masks of confusion as they knelt beside Briggs and Ortiz. They shot cautious glances at Mara, as if they were half convinced she could break their bones simply by looking at them. The rest of the candidates shifted uneasily, the facade of invincibility that young, untested men often were beginning to crack in the presence of someone who clearly understood violence in a way they did not yet comprehend. And beneath that unease lay something deeper, a dawning respect, a whisper building through the formation, a question forming in every mind. Who exactly is Lieutenant Mara Tress? But I knew something they didn't. This moment, the mud, the dislocated shoulders, the sudden appending of assumptions. This wasn't even the real story. This was just the spark. Because if the candidates thought this was the part they'd remember years from now, they were wrong. What came next? The revelation of who she really was, of what she had already survived long before she showed up on this grinder, would shake every one of them harder than anything the Pacific, the instructors, or Hell Week could ever deliver. And from where I stood, watching her wipe mud from her face with the quiet indifference of someone who had long ago stopped being impressed by large men with loud voices, I understood something with absolute clarity. The real lesson had only just begun. What unfolded in the minutes after the medics escorted Briggs and Ortiz toward the training clinic became something of a quiet legend, the kind that spreads through a command not in shouts or rumors, but in the reverent hush that follows an event no one fully understands at first. And from my vantage point on the grinder, clipboard forgotten at my side, I watched the moment Lieutenant Mara Tress ceased being the medic in the eyes of 180 SEAL candidates and instead became something infinitely more complicated, more respected, and more unsettling to men who suddenly realized they had grossly misjudged the person standing among them. Chief Vance, still absorbing the shock of what he'd witnessed, ordered the class back into loose formation. But even he seemed reluctant to speak, as though one wrong tone might crack the stillness that had settled over the grinder like a low fog. Mara stood a few feet away from me, wiping streaks of drying mud from her arms with calm, precise movements, her expression unreadable, her breathing steady as if she had just completed nothing more strenuous than a warm-up lap. And then, as the candidates attempted to reassemble themselves into something resembling discipline, the unmistakable growl of a gov rolled across the courtyard, slow, deliberate, the sound of authority arriving with intent. The vehicle came to a halt beside the grinder, and out stepped Commander Hale, the executive officer of the entire training command, a man whose presence alone could silence a room. Behind him emerged Senior Chief Brannick and Lieutenant Commander Saito, officers who rarely appeared anywhere near the candidate training area unless something extraordinary had happened. Hale's boots hit the pavement with a heaviness that made the nearest candidates stiffen involuntarily, and his eyes scanned the scene with the cold efficiency of a man who had spent half his life distinguishing problems from catastrophes. When his gaze found Mara, mud-streaked, posture perfect, utterly unbothered, his eyebrows ticked up by a fraction. He approached her directly, bypassing Vance, bypassing the formation, bypassing the protocol that usually kept officers at a polite distance from unfolding chaos. "Lieutenant Tress," he said, voice even, almost quiet. "Would you step forward?" She did, without hesitation or flourish, the embodiment of military professionalism despite looking like she had been dredged from a swamp. Hale regarded her for a long moment before speaking again. "We've had an interesting report." His eyes flicked toward the clinic where Briggs and Ortiz had been taken, then back to her, as if trying to reconcile the information with the calm woman standing before him. "So I'm going to ask you directly. Did you intentionally injure my candidates?" Mara answered with the same tone she might have used to confirm a blood pressure reading. "No, sir. They lost balance. Twice." Vance had to physically look away to suppress a smile. Hale didn't smile, but something in his stern expression softened, just a millimeter, but enough that I was certain he knew exactly what she meant. Still, he turned so his voice would carry toward the entire formation. "Candidates," he announced. "I assume by now you've realized Lieutenant Tress is not simply your assigned medical officer." A ripple ran through the ranks. Hale folded his hands behind his back, posture sharp, eyes sweeping the crowd. Before arriving here, she served with Marine Special Operations Forces as their SOF medic, a billet that requires a level of resilience, adaptability, and combat readiness far beyond the expectations of standard Navy medical personnel. The formation shifted in collective astonishment. Hale continued. During her last deployment, her Raider platoon was ambushed in Al-Qara Pass. Her lead vehicle was struck by an EFP. She regained consciousness under fire, dragged two unconscious Marines out of a burning MRAP, and held off an enemy assault long enough for the team to regroup. She stabilized, for casualties while bleeding from her own shrapnel wounds, and continued to return fire until CASEVAC arrived. His voice hardened, echoing off the grinder. For that action, she was recommended for the Silver Star. A gasp rolled through the rows of candidates. Not theatrical, not exaggerated, but the involuntary exhale of men realizing the person they had dismissed, mocked, and manhandled had been forged in violence they had not yet earned the right to imagine. Mara stood silent, eyes forward, no pride in her expression, only that familiar steadiness, the kind that sits in the bones of someone who survived something dark and walked out carrying everyone they could. Hale addressed the candidates again, his tone icier now. "If any of you thought her size meant weakness, let this morning serve as a reminder that strength is not measured in inches or decibels, but in what a person has already endured." The class stood frozen, some unable to meet her eyes, others looking as though they'd just seen a ghost, one of the helpful ones. Hale stepped back, nodding toward Vance. "Proceed." And just like that, the command staff retreated toward the vehicle, their boots leaving faint impressions on the pavement that somehow felt ceremonial. Vance turned to face the formation, hands behind his back, lips pressed together tightly. "Candidates," he barked. "If I hear so much as one disrespectful word about Lieutenant Tress from this point forward, I will personally run your asses into the ocean until Poseidon starts filing paperwork." A unified "Yes, Chief," shook the air. But the moment that sealed everything came seconds later, quiet and unforced. As the candidates prepared to resume training, Callan, the only one of the three who hadn't ended up in a sling, stepped out of formation, face pale, jaw tight with something that almost looked like shame. He approached Mara slowly, carefully, as though nearing a landmine. "Ma'am," he said, voice raw, I didn't know who you were." Mara tilted her head, expression soft but firm. "Then next time," she said, "don't act before you understand the person in front of you." He nodded, swallowing hard, and stepped back into formation. For a long beat, there was nothing but the rhythmic crash of waves behind the grinder. And then, as the candidates prepared for their next evolution, something subtle happened, something I still think about. They didn't part for her out of fear. They parted out of respect, out of recognition, out of the sudden, humbling realization that true strength often comes in quiet forms, covered in mud, carrying scars no one sees until the moment they're forced into the light. And as I watched her step past them, small but unshakable, I understood the truth that would echo through Coronado long after this class graduated. They had arrived at BUD/S to learn how to become warriors, but on that morning, in that mud pit, they had learned it from someone who already was one.